Welcome to Series 3 of Digit Debates, and we're really delighted to have Abigail Marks here today to talk about a very pertinent issue that I'm sure most of us have been experiencing this year, thinking it was only going to be something that might last at the maximum 3 months. Anyway, a year on. So on the website, you'll find details about her bibliography, where she's Professor of the Future of Work at Newcastle University and is leading on a new ESRC project that's about to wrap up at the end of next month, on Working at Home project, and there's a fantastic link to her website there where you can find more details about it. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Abigail, and we really look forward to hearing the results from your new study.
Thank you very much. Right, and now do I now need to have to work out how to share the screen?
If you click that little green button at the bottom, it's
okay. Good God, the technology, I can't cope. Right, okay, here we go. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Jackie. So yeah, this project is about to end. So as I was saying just before we all came live, that the project started in May last year. I'll tell you a bit about it, or a bit more about it as I go along. But the project started in May last year with the initial aim to look at how people coped with home working under COVID measures, but then how they coped with the return to work. So we immediately have not necessarily met the objectives of the grant, but what we have done is really looked at people's intent in terms of the return to work and people's thoughts about hybrid working and what they want going forwards. So very much the focus of this talk is not just on people's experiences in the pandemic, but the implications of their experience during the pandemic for what is going forward, what the world of work may be, and what people actually want. So, as I said, I'm going to do a quick overview relatively early on at what we found that what people want going forward, and the factors that determine what people want. We're also going to look at the impact of the pandemic and the implications of the pandemic on new ways of working. And then linked to that, we're going to look at the evolution and reaction to technology for home and hybrid working. So I'm going to cover a lot at a very fast pace. The other thing I ought to apologise for, I've got 2 dogs in the room with me. They will probably start barking at some point. So this is the peril of home working. And the post hasn't been yet today. Okay, so I'm just going to throw this slide up. What is happening in terms of home working? Well, we know, everybody pretty much knows this. This is a standard narrative since the beginning of the pandemic, which is really a very small proportion of the UK labour force fully worked from home in February 2019. Then by the time you hit April, you've got over 40% of the UK population fully home working. This figure has ebbed and flowed throughout the last year or so, and is slowly starting to drop off. But one of the popular narratives, really from the start of the pandemic, has been that the office is to be a thing of the past. And as you see from this slide, we've got all sorts of prophecies about plans for home working, plans for hybrid working, both in terms of the structure of hybrid working, what will happen, forms of taxation that people are threatening to those people that don't want to go back to the office. There's discussions about the destruction of city centres because of the removal of office spaces and therefore the disappearance of the Pret economy, associated Pret economy. And then yesterday, the BBC very kindly released information on a Centre for Cities piece of research, which claims that the 5-day office-based working week will become the norm again. I would like, hopefully, as I said, to provide some insights into that have emerged from the project, the home working project. And I said the last phase of the research, which is the current interviews that we're undertaking, and part of the last survey was really looking at people's intention going forward. So just a quick overview. So I'd very much like to say that any presentation that I'm doing on this project is very much a team effort. There's 4 of us on the project. We all fully collaborate. So there's myself, who is based at the University of Newcastle. There's Danny, who's the researcher on the project, and there's Oliver, who is at Stirling, and Leela at Edinburgh, but it's very much an equal partnership. So what we have done is 4 sets of interviews with a panel of 80 participants, starting at the end of May, June last year. And we are just finishing the 4th phase of interviews. And they are all new home workers. So they're all people that didn't fully work from home at the start of the pandemic. And if they did work from home, it was only for a very, very small proportion of their time. We also had actually got two. We're supposed to have 3 surveys. We have 2 surveys so far, with relatively large numbers of people, again across the UK, with really sort of representative demographics. So in terms of socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, etc. And as you can see here, the second survey, we had a much better representation in terms of males and females, because we got a third-party provider in to help us with that. So we've got a really good, in particular panel interviews, we've got a really, really good understanding of how people's experiences changed over time, and how people, what they wanted post-pandemic, and how they experienced home working changed over time. So as I said, there are a number of prophecies about what the future of work will look like, what the future of home working will look like. There seems to be some indication that majority of people think we will hit hybrid working, despite the report yesterday. Certainly a lot of employers are talking about hybrid working, certainly the employers we've spoken to, although very few actually have a clear plan on what this hybrid working will look like. We've spoken to large office providers in city centres, and they certainly have said that any interest in their space has been in terms of co-working space rather than office space. And again, as we know, a lot of workplaces are trying to give up their city centre office space. So as I said, what I'd like to do is just quickly go over what we have found in terms of what people want going forward. And certainly, this is from our second survey, but certainly the survey, which was undertaken December, the end of last year, and January, February, the beginning of this year, and certainly the interview findings to a large extent reflect these findings, as do other large projects that have looked at home working under COVID. So what you can see here is there's a really, really mixed pattern of what people want going forwards post-COVID. The largest segment, which is just under a quarter, say that they would like to be at home 2 or 3 days a week. We've got 18% want to be at home 3 or 4 days, 7% say they want to go back to the office, and then you've got others saying 10% saying 5 days. So there's a real mix. So what we have tried to do, we've tried to sort of break down these findings in terms of what is likely to predict home-based working. And that's actually been quite hard. That there are very few clear profiles in terms of who is likely to want more home-based working. So what we did was obviously looked at gender, whether people have children or not, the age of their children, disability, etc., etc., etc. We also looked at some of their work experiences, what their home-based office setup is like, to see if any of these had any prediction as to who would want to be spending the most time at home going forwards. I am only going to do a quick reporting of those that had any significance. So the ones that I'm going forwards are the only ones that had any statistical significance. So unsurprisingly, there was statistical evidence, or statistically significant evidence, that those people who reported having a disability were more likely to spend a greater proportion, or want to spend a greater proportion of time working at home. And certainly from our interviews, those people that had a recognised disability certainly saw great benefit in terms of expanded opportunities for home working. Again, unsurprisingly, those people that had a dedicated home office were much more likely to increase, or want an increase in the number of home-based working days. And again, unsurprisingly, in those households where there was both men and women in the household working, it was much more likely that the man in the household got the dedicated home-based office, or the home office. If there was a dedicated office space or spare bedroom, it's much more likely to go to the man in the household. again, unsurprisingly, those people that were able to concentrate better at home or felt that they could concentrate were much more likely to be positive about spending more time working from home. And again, those people that had a reduced number of distractions were much more likely to be at home. As I said, I'm just reporting on those findings that were statistically significant. So you can imagine there are also a lot of factors that at the moment haven't determined what we perceive to have an impact on home-based working, although we're only sort of partial way through this analysis. So those people, again, who found the increased blurring of boundaries between home and work were much more likely to want to go back to the office. And this was a recurring theme, that we found that most people liked a boundary, whether it's a physical boundary instead of in having their private office space, or a psychological boundary in terms of what we call faking a commute. So going for a walk in the morning, doing some exercise after work, some activity that mimics a commute. Those people that had clearer boundaries were much more positive about spending more time home working in the future. Similarly, we've got some evidence that those people who had caring responsibilities felt that at a greater proportion of time at home, they were more likely to be able to fulfill their care roles. What we haven't analysed, and we need to do a bit of coding for this, is the impact on organisational roles. So whether people with line management responsibilities or those people in particular occupational groups are more likely to have a good experience with home-based working and want to stay at home. So it's sort of important to try and understand who wants to work at home. But for those people that were working at home, and for those people that are possibly less keen to remain at home, I think it's important to understand the potential problems that were associated with home-based working. And as well as obviously the physical problems in terms of a high proportion of people having musculoskeletal problems, there was quite a lot of evidence that our home-based workers in particular were developing quite significant problems in terms of anxiety and depression, but also the pace of work and the performance aspect of work was clearly becoming a significant problem for many of our workers. So I'd just like to sort of move on to talk about the burden for workers for those people that transitioned to home-based working at the start of the pandemic. So obviously there is a strong history looking at the damage that broadly unreasonable work can cause employees. Obviously following the work of Francis Green on work intensification, work on work-life balance, overwork, overload, and the pace of work. Pace of work is really quite important for those people home-based working during the pandemic. What we found, and I'm using this term overburden for workers. I think I've mentioned this before, so for anybody else that's been at a talk that we've looked at performance and burden for workers, is that started off by looking at using the term burden, and then you think, should work actually be burdensome? So we've put overburden in brackets. The over is in brackets because I think by its very nature, most people find work a burden. It's the point where it becomes an acceptable burden to an overburden. So we thought the three main problems that cause an overburden for workers, which is the location of work, is the location convenient, the pace of work, is it too fast, is there a nice natural ebb and flow to the working day that makes everything okay, and the actual volume of work, the amount of work. And then how this impacts on the individuals, how they negotiate these factors is what determines any work burden. Under a pandemic scenario, particularly looking at these new home workers, we think there are three broadly interrelated issues which impact on workplace burden, and these all again link to pace and space, etc. So there's three factors: the overburdening because of the pandemic itself, so additional work that employees have been subject to due to furlough of colleagues, etc., changed and enhanced procedures because of the pandemic. Overburdening as a response to unenforced home working, so the management of shared working space, poor home working space, homeschooling, and problems with the management of access to people and artifacts that you would usually have in the office space. And thirdly, the overburdening as a response to the remote working technology. So everybody's really had to quickly adapt, as we all know, to Slack, to Zoom, to Teams, and how the new rules within a meeting scenario, also potential impact of algorithmic control, etc., for those workers that were previously or did not previously perceive that they were subject to such factors. So we've looked at these three main areas in terms of the overburdening of employees, or workers rather. So just a quick, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the data. It's really is just a small section of the data, just trying to give a flavour of what we found. As you can see from the beginning, we have an awful lot of data. So I'm just reporting on elements of it. So let's look at, in terms of the quantity and quality of work, about 1 in 5 of our participants report a decrease in work, but the majority of respondents report an increase in their productivity. Now, this is one of my bugbears in terms of this the media depiction, or not even the media, but the depiction of home working, which is about a month ago, maybe slightly longer than that, CIPD launched a report from managers saying that it was a slightly over 30% increase in productivity since people have been home working at the beginning of the pandemic. This has been massively celebrated. I think this is a real issue. Why? Where's this productivity come from, and at what cost to the employee? And certainly we found that there's been a significant cost to employees in terms of this change of the pace of work and the extent that employees are feeling burdened by being at home, or the way that work is constructed when they're at home. So we have a question here. Under COVID-19 measures, I feel that the current balance between my working life and other aspects of my life, for example, family and friends, is optimal. 50% disagree. That's quite significant that 50% of I think this was the first day, 50% of nearly 1,500 people were identifying a significant problem here. Again, another question, similar question, which has, again, 44% somewhat agree to strongly agree that the current balance between working life is optimal, but then that leaves over 50% arguing it's suboptimal. Then if you look at survey 2, have you felt recently under strain? So I said this is start of this year, end of last year, when people had become more used to home working. You've got nearly 40% saying that they were, yes, probably, yes, constantly under strain, and 21% uncertain and unhappy and depressed. We've got a really worrying figure of 18% uncertain, but 43% saying that they recently felt unhappy or depressed. And this was certainly reflected in our interviews. By the time it got to the third round of interviews, which again, which a time period that mirrored the second survey, people were really, really struggling with their mental health. And certainly within our 80 interview participants, we had one that had been an attempt at suicide, and certainly a lot of people that had taken significant amount of time off work. So people's mental health at this point was suffering. People were struggling, and it was a combination of being, again, under lockdown, the middle of winter, but also the very nature of home-based working and the expectations placed on them. So here we've got a quote, or a couple of quotes from our interview participants about the overburdening because of the pandemic. I will read one of them because there is a limited amount of time. So we've got the quote here from the admin officer was, "I'm tired. There's no doubt the second lockdown seems to be hitting everyone much harder. It's almost as if we held our breath to get through the first lot. And then especially my colleagues that have got children, they're really finding it hard going, and the teachers are ramped up quite a lot. And quite a lot of my colleagues' kids seem to require proper supervision. Then there's a knock at the door. An effect for us that aren't in the situation because we're not there when you need them to be. You might be covering a bit for them, and when they're able to meet with you, it's very intense. None of it's what's whether you are. It's like I've got there's some poor transcription there. I've got half an hour, so someone says in front of the computer, can we tackle this thorny issue? It's quite intense. So really there's concerns about the extent to which people are split in terms of their obligations. Then we've got overburdening because they move to home working. So a female support worker, because the casework takes much more like things I could do on the phone during the day, I usually do it in writing at night and send it over. So I could get it quickly done. You know, if I raise a complaint with someone on the phone on behalf of a client, it takes 5 minutes. If I have to do it in writing officially, it takes me half an hour to draft a proper good letter. Yet she does not get any more time now that she is home working. So this is somebody that's on a 16-hour-a-week contract yet, and she has a child at home with severe disabilities, and she was shielding at the beginning of the pandemic. She's a lone parent, and she's really, really struggling because work are not accommodating the fact that it's taking longer because of the very nature of home-based working. In terms of, again, looking at some of the survey findings, so work-life balance is positively influenced by organisational IT support. So organisations can make a really important difference to the extent to which people are managing to cope with home-based working. So obviously there's the real impact of people having good IT support, but also a psychological impact of people perceiving that they're being supported. Work-life balance is also impacted by home working equipment. So those people that had some sort of financial subsidy for broadband, that got desks, chairs, laptops, etc., were much more likely to have a positive experience and a less damaging experience. Then there is obviously the overburdening, but due to the absolute pace of work. So the pace of work under the pandemic has changed. People are having less downtime than they were pre-pandemic. And certainly there is the natural ebb and flow of the working day has disappeared. And, you know, on a scale of 0 to 100, people are operating at 80 to 100 and with very little operation below that. And that is exhausting for people. And there are a number of reasons for this. And one of the concerns that we have is going forward, this absolute pace of work, this lack of a natural ebb and flow, which is how people cope with the working day, this is disappearing. And if people are predominantly going to be at home, this is going to have a significant impact. So we have a Mayo University lecturer here who was one of our participants, who there's a couple of comments here about the change in the sort of natural pace of work. And this is partly to do with you stop in the corridor, you have a chat with somebody, that changes the pace. The fact that people are back to back with Zoom meetings, not only the intensity of the number of meetings, but the pace of the meetings and how the meetings go. But he very much focused on, we don't have time for chit chat before or afterwards. So everything is absolutely full on all the time. And then you've got other people here say, so we've got an adult social care worker saying, I find it difficult to leave it. I think it's more difficult. I think going to work and coming home enables you to better switch off. I think going from meeting to meeting without breaks is not good for anyone. And we know we're all doing that. So if you're in the office, you'll be very, very unlikely to schedule meetings from 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 till 12, 12 to 1, because you'd be aware of the fact that you needed to walk between meetings or you needed to nip back to your office and get something. In a home working scenario, people are, everybody here well knows, we're working in back-to-back meetings, and some of the meetings are meetings that we would have by picking up the phone before or just knocking on people's doors. So there is an increased volume of meetings, and all of this is really impacting on the pace of work. So one of the questions we asked in the last survey was how much time people spend using collaborative or video conferencing software during a typical working day. We have here, obviously there's quite a variation. Some people, just under half the people were 0 to 2 hours, but then you end up with between about 13 or 23%, 7 to 10 hours. That is a lot of time using collaborative or video conferencing software during a working day. This isn't the number, this isn't how much time you're spending online or how much time you're actually spending talking to people. This is how much time you're actually spending using video conferencing software. So it's a lot of time being quite full on in a rather intense scenario. So what is the impact of this intensive use of collaborative or video conferencing technology on people? Well, again, doing an initial sift through the data, what we found is that there's a very clear relationship between the time that people spend using collaborative or video conferencing software and the intensity of their overall work demands. That the more time people spend using such software, the greater the perception of always working. The greater they time spending using collaborative or video conferencing software, the more they feel they're too frazzled to do family activities, and they're more likely to force to increasingly work time schedules. Again, all of this was mirrored in terms of the 80 panel participants. More than a quarter of participants felt that they could work. The technology made them work more than they can handle, and a quarter reported that technology forces them to work faster than they are used to. So yeah, as I said, this is reflected in the panel interviews, probably at every stage in the interviews. Maybe the first stage, which is the adaptation phase, maybe not, but certainly going forwards. Secondly, this isn't solely a pandemic-related issue. If it is the case that we're all going to move to hybrid working, or organisations are going to encourage people to spend more time at home, then it's very, very, very much the case that this is going to be something going forwards. And this is something, as researchers, and certainly something that policymakers and employers really need to think about, because we could be potentially hitting a bigger mental health crisis than the one we're already hitting based on the pandemic. So there was quite clearly a lot of evidence of technological overload. And respondents who reported feeling overloaded with working from home because the new technology also reported they felt stress in their family and private lives. They reported negative work-life balance and reported high levels of stress. And if you go back to some of the panel interviews, at the start of the pandemic, as we all know, everybody was focused on Zoom quizzes, Zoom catch-ups with family and friends, and that very quickly disappeared 6 months into the pandemic. In a way that people wouldn't lose face-to-face contact. And part of this, when we asked our participants, is like, I'm online all day, every day. I'm on Zoom and Teams all day, every day as part of my job. I don't want this to be my post-work time as well. So it was having a significant impact. This new movement towards this collaborative software, conference-based software, is impacting on people's lives in all sorts of ways. So how's technology going to impact in terms of moving forwards, particularly in terms of this move towards hybrid working? Well, as I've said, whether we're in the home or whether we're in the office, the burden associated with technology will progress. It's going to continue and we can't get away from it. And employers are going to have to really think about how to manage it. I know some workplaces have said no meetings on a Friday. There's been, the right to disconnect. That's something that needs to be much more closely looked at. For many, there's a concern about monitoring software, but there's also other concerns for employees, such as the basic use of webcams. So there's a whole new set of politics emerging in terms of webcams. So we've had participants, particularly in the interviews, where their employers have insisted that webcams are turned on in all meetings, but also when talking to clients as well. So people that previously worked in call centres, just answering calls, and now told that they have to do it with their webcams on, so they have to be visible as well. We have participants who worked in the banking sector who are not allowed to use a home working space for their banking work that they use for any social activity, so that the webcam is not for any of their social activities, cannot pick up any materials that they're using for banking, any potentially confidential material, which therefore is requiring them to have two spaces, one space for non-work computer use and one space for work-based computer work. So it's a really sort of quite invasive some invasive activities in terms of webcams. There's also some really quite innovative but potentially strange stuff going on in terms of hybrid software. So we've certainly met with one organisation who's developing hybrid working software in terms of looking at meta worlds. So what they are doing is developing a mirror image of the office in terms of a computer generated meta world. And then there is suggestions that people in the office will have sensors on them. So in effect, you can virtually or in presence walk past people in corridors, arrange meetings with them. So if you'd walk past somebody in a corridor, if they'd knocked on your virtual door, whether they are in the office or not, you can click on something and then ping straight into a Zoom meeting. So this is how, at the extreme end, employers and tech organizations are talking about how to introduce hybrid software going forwards. So, and if you're in the office, why would you want to go to the office if you had a sensor on you the whole day? So there's some really, really fascinating things going on in terms of organizations and how they are using the technology to monitor and control employees' activities. What are the implications of at least this part of our findings, particularly in terms of the pace of work? I think if we're going to put a positive spin on it, one of the things that we need to do is use the pandemic and the experience of people at home working and this real intensification of work is to look at the pace and structure of work going forwards, both theoretically and practically. So, this artificial construct of a 37.5-hour week, 5-day working day. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting we all move to a four-day working week, because I can see so many issues with that. But we need to look at what we mean by work, particularly since what's happening now is much more intense and potentially more damaging. If we're going to look really moving to this remote hybrid working model, we really need to think of work, rethink work, not in terms of hours, but in terms of the management of the ebb and flow of the working day and the non-work day. Because if you are based in your home space, for some it's fine, for some it's great, for other people, home stops being a place of leisure and relaxation, and the world starts moving. And certainly I was doing one of the final phases of interviews yesterday, and one of my participants likened her house to a prison. So she was in quite a small house. She was using her bedroom as an office. She had a child at home, and she said, I hate being in my house now. It feels like a prison. And the implications in terms of sort of the use of technology, particularly in terms of the opportunity for surveillance and algorithmic control, which have been afforded by remote working technologies and are more prevalent than they were a year ago, makes people more stressed and more anxious, and is much more likely to have a further impact on the pace of work and employees' perception of overburden. So where does this leave us? This is really where we're coming to the end of my very, very rapid whistle-stop tour. The burden due to rapid move towards homeworking and pandemic will have a long-term impact. So the first two, so when I looked at the overburden in terms of pandemic-related and the rapid move to homeworking, that will have an impact going forwards. There's been a significant detriment to people's well-being and mental health, for the stress of homeschooling and working as well, the intensification, just the sort of bleak reality of what happened. But the burden due to the technology is the enduring concern. That's the one that isn't going to go away in time. And we need to be aware that organisations and individuals are making massive decisions about the future of work based on 18 months of unprecedented times. And there is no doubt, certainly based on our research, there is certainly no doubt there's been a shift in what people want going forward and where they perceive their work to be located. But I think everything needs to proceed with caution. The final point I'd like to make is based on the final phase of interviews. And some of the so we've focused the final phase of interviews on performance and productivity and how people now structure their working days. And there's been some really, really concerning ways in which employees have now constructed what is appropriate work behaviour and patterns. So I had one participant who was telling me, so she's a call centre worker, she was telling me that if she decides she wants to empty the dishwasher or answer the door during work times, what she does is she calculates how much time that took and takes it off her lunch break. So I said, but if you're in the office you came off a call and had to have, actually I think you should supervise, you had to come off a call and chat to somebody, would you take that off your lunch break? No, she wouldn't do that. So I sort of use this as an example for my next interview participant who said, oh yeah, no, absolutely. And she was sort of middle management within the NHS. She said exactly the same thing. No, I would definitely take it off my my lunch break. So if somebody knocked on your door while you're at work and had a 10-minute chat with you, that then went on to a discussion about how your families work, would you take that off your lunch break? No, I wouldn't take that off my lunch break. So there's some really quite concerning patterns in the way that people are now constructing work behaviour. Work is absolutely categorically work. So people working 3-4 hours in the morning with no break, and any break that they are taking, even if it's just to answer the door, it seems to be, for many people, the standard practice is to take that off formal lunch time. So I think we have a real issue going forward soon. But that is the end of my presentation. So I'll be really delighted to have any questions, comments. Really excited to get some discussion.
Thank you very much, Abigail. That's fantastic and very provoking. And I know there will be a lot of people in the audience with some questions. Andrew Pakes, is there a question you want to ask there directly?
Yes, there was one in it. Thanks, Jackie, yep. And thank you for the.
Can you introduce yourself for others who don't know you?
Sorry, yes, apologies for that. The heat in London is melting me. I'm Andrew Pakes. I'm the research director at a trade union called Prospect.
Hi.
So definitely your research, there's loads of positives in flexible working, hybrid working, but your research picks up on a huge amount of the kind of informal economy of feedback that we're getting around how this fits together. And I think everything from right to disconnect, the stress, homework balance, different types of software. I think it's a fascinating discussion around how privacy has changed as a concept in the last year.
Yeah.
Even employers are now watching us in our homes as opposed to watching us in our offices. And then there's a psychological burden of that. The bit I'm really interested in and we're reflecting on is, lots of these conversations about the future are happening now in real time with employers coming to us or not coming to us and deciding what these rules look like. The missing ingredient is, or evidence base, I think, is around worker experiences of what does good look like. So my question is, I'm interested in, amongst the dystopian future you described, or dystopian present, have you been able to tease out of that any worker experiences or respondent experiences around what should those boundaries between work and home look like? Is it just the length of the day? Are there tips or reflections people have given you that you could point to? These could be the characteristics of how we get this right.
I think there are lots of people. I mean, I know, sorry, if it was a dystopian presentation, there are some people that had some really good experiences and have obviously then decided that moving forward that they will be moving towards a more hybrid or home working experience based on their experience in the pandemic. Those people, and it's often due to the balance of their caring responsibilities or the management of any disability that has led to that. In terms of positive experience, it seems to be those people in more senior positions who have greater amounts of autonomy, that have their the pressures on them are more task-based rather than or outcome-based rather than small tasks during the day. It's also those people that have had, there's been a really key role for line management. Those people that have had super supportive line management, understanding line managers, accessible line managers are having a much better experience. Those people that feel they are supported by the organisation in terms of, it's trivial, but in terms of good equipment, because I think that's not only a practical offering, but it's a signpost about the way that the organisation are operating. So I think it's not rocket science, is it? And it's also about, your line manager saying, please stop booking meeting after meeting after meeting, take a break. It's giving people permission.
Great. Can I hand over to Aisha? Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha. I'm a researcher based at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also visiting fellow at Digit this year. Thanks, Abigail, for your really detailed presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it really speaks to my work. So I'm currently doing some research on workers working from home for the first time in Delhi. And I'm specifically looking at young women and what their experiences have been like. Is this something that they see as valuable and positive and that they'd like to continue, etc.? So it was really interesting to see this in a comparative framework. I think just some of the points that you were discussing in response to Andrew's question. So questions of boundaries, autonomy, freedom, experiences generally. One thing that I'm quite curious about is workers' subjectivities. And I wondered if you had anything come up at all in terms of, especially workers who are, you describe people who are, for example, also caring for someone in the same space that they're working in, whether that kind of blurred space of home and work led to dissolved subjectivities in terms of workers not necessarily feeling like workers completely, because they don't have the space to be completely workers, but rather feeling like carers or mothers or house workers or whatever the case might be. So I don't know whether there were any experiences that you came across along those lines.
To some extent, certainly that was very much the case. I think it was more teachers at the beginning of the pandemic, where that was horrific for a lot of people. People that had primary school age children in particular, it was grim. It was really, really grim. People were really, really struggling. People were asking to be furloughed, all sorts of people were asking for, unpaid leave. That was unbelievably awful. So people couldn't feel like employees, they felt like teachers and parents. Later on, when children were back at school, and for those people that didn't have children, I think it's more, for our experience, it's been much more the other way around. So people, instead of feeling like individuals, parents, partners, whatever, they felt like workers. So very much the invasion of the work into the home space. It's really obvious. Some of this is really obvious. Those people that felt less like that were those people that had a dedicated office. The laptop stayed in the office. The door shut at 5 o'clock. That was that. But it's a really, really hard balance, because one of the benefits people found from working at home was being able to work in the office, work downstairs in the kitchen, work in the bedroom. But then that made them feel like work was invading their private space. So it's a really curious, blurred set of findings. Really depend very much on individual circumstances and individual perceptions.
Thank you.
I've got a line of questions coming up now. So Jana Javornik has asked me to ask it for her. And she wanted to know whether you'd looked at issues around, you mentioned some of the things around gender and age, both old and younger workers, I imagine, and whether and how these shape the way one's lived expectation and future wants might have been created in different ways by these groups. And after that, we have Anne MacDonald and Petros. So if you want to ask that first one about differentiating between the different experiences of different workers.
So younger workers and older workers, in some ways, had much more similar experiences than those in the middle. So younger workers in particular were desperate to get back to the office, really, really struggled because the very nature of their experiences. So they're often at the start of their career, they need the organisational socialisation, they are potentially living in their parents' houses, shared housing, so working and living within in that space was constrained. Their social life for many was very much centred around the office, so they really struggled and were desperate to get back to the office. Older workers, again, there was a greater keenness to go back to work because the children had left home. Often, again, they were either living on their own or just living with their partner who they'd lived with for 30 or 40 years and were really happy to get back to work. So whilst they struggled less than much younger workers being at home, they were certainly keen to get back to the office. It was those in the middle, particularly those in less senior roles in the middle, that were more keen to stay at home because it did offer that flexibility in terms of often caring responsibilities.
Great. I've got a nice long queue now. I'm going to take two questions. So Anne and Petros, if you would both like to ask a question, then after that it's Greg and Irina. So Anne, would you also like to introduce us? Anne's first and then Petros, if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
I'm Anne MacDonald. I work on a US project that's in digital futures and how people use it for social protection. So my question just is, did you ask questions about loneliness and isolation? Because
Yes.
if you are living on your own and then you're working on your own, or as you say, even with a partner who may be not going to work or whatever. So that's one question. So did you, and what did you find out?
We have got survey questions on loneliness and isolation. That is one area we haven't got to analysing it. As you know, we've still been busy doing data collection, so that's that. In terms of the interviews, obviously, we're much more hands-on with those. Those people living on their own clearly struggled more, and clearly are much less keen to spend a lot of time home working, particularly in the first two phases of the interviews. Which were obviously early on in the pandemic, they struggled because they were, people were not seeing anybody. It created quite an interesting dynamic between us as the researcher and them, because we spoke to them twice, and it's that boundary between being a researcher and being a counsellor. So we often, particularly the less experienced members of the research team, really struggled, and we actually did some redistribution of participants. So we all kept our own participants throughout, but we ended up doing a redistribution for those people that were struggling for the more experienced researchers, because people were really struggling. Lone parents, people living on their own at the start of the pandemic, there is no doubt there was this extreme level of isolation. To some extent, that hasn't always predicted whether people want to go back into the office or not, because some people would quite like the space. They can, if they're integrated into their community, if they have a good friendship network, that seems to be okay. But I mean, I'm sure, as you have picked up, as everybody has picked up, there was a horrible, awful degree of loneliness. At the start, it was really, we had some really sad interviews with people. People on their own lost their jobs. Horrific, heartbreaking.
Can I just ask one question? One really quick question. So, do you think that unless businesses see the effect on their bottom line, they won't put in the measures to help people's mental health, and they'll do it in a, as you said, rather depressingly, they'll do it in a way that helps their business, whatever, but they won't take into account enough about people's mental health unless they can actually see that the effect on their bottom line.
I think, being cynical, I think a lot of organisations will operate like that. I think not all organisations. Certainly, it's not going to be universal, but I do worry about it. And as I said before, the worry of the CIPD, my big worry is the CIPD report and how much publicity it got, and celebrating this 30% increase in productivity since people worked at home. And I actually just wanted to bury my head in my pillow and cry, because I'd spoken to, we've spoken to 80 people, we know what the reality was. And yes, it was increased productivity, but people were also scared of losing their jobs. People, there was this, obviously people were put on furlough, for many that led to becoming redundant. People were terrified. People are terrified of losing their jobs, so they performed. So this celebration of this increase in productivity, I find really frightening.
Just in hope to get everybody in now, can I ask each of you, sorry, Petros and Greg and then Irina, could you each ask your questions so that make sure they all get asked, and briefly introduce yourself? Thanks, Petros.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Abigail, for the nice work. I'm Petros. Petros Komikoris. I work at the ESCP Business School in Madrid. I was previously at Sussex, and I'm still affiliated with Digit as well. I have more of a comment to make. So, and I'm inappropriately going to advertise my own work as well, which we had a paper accepted yesterday, which actually extends or builds on what you presented today. And I have a comment, I'm not sure if it's something that came up in your studies as well, that speaks to Andrew's question earlier about what does good work look like in this context. And I think one of the issues that we found, and you kind of hinted at it too, but you didn't actually spell it out, is the fact that we often, and I have to say that I come from an IS background, so my work is on digital transformation. And this comment is about digital transformation and the fact that we tend to replicate work practices in the virtual environment. And it is that replication that causes the issues of burnout and the issues that you discussed in your work. Instead, what I'm arguing in the paper that I'm talking about now is that we need to truly transform ourselves and our work practices instead of replicating. And a practical example of what I'm saying is essentially the fact that, a 2-hour meeting face-to-face cannot be a 2-hour meeting online. It should be a 10 minutes online. Yeah, the social, you mentioned chit chat and those things that are missing in the digital environment. There's a way to build social context and to maintain it when working virtually as well. So these are areas that I think good work in this context should look like, and that's just not a criticism. It's more like an extension of what you presented, if you like. I'm not sure if you agree or if you
No, I absolutely agree. I think that
just because Greg and Irena have been waiting, and I want to make sure they get a chance to ask their questions too, and then you'll be able to kind of respond to all three if you don't mind. A bit more work intensification there, but Greg, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself as well and what your question is?
Thanks very much, Abigail. Can you hear me from Melbourne, Australia? Okay. I'm at Monash University here. I'm also a visiting professor at Newcastle, but I haven't been able to get there since you were appointed, unfortunately. So we're now in our 4th lockdown in Melbourne. But my inference is that you're analysing the experiences of the workers, which is great. I'm just wondering whether another perspective might be to try and conceptualize different experiences and different approaches by employers in terms of Fox's notion of high versus low trust work situations. And to an extent that might reflect the levels of seniority, as you've alluded to. But I'm also wondering if it might be possible to consider workers in similar work situations where some might be offered considerable discretion and a high trust relationship with the employer in comparison with others in similar situations where people might not be trusted and monitored to within an inch of their lives. And one hypothesis might be that the public sector context might be more likely to offer a high trust and perhaps a private sector, a low trust context. But thank you for your great work.
And the last question will be from Irena. I've got a ton of questions, but I most probably won't get a chance to ask them. Over to you, Irena. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Jackie. I'm Irena Gregoulis. I'm Professor of Working Skills at Leeds University. Really enjoyed the presentation, Abigail. Absolutely brilliant piece of research. I'm just wondering about differentiating between experienced and inexperienced staff. Some colleagues at Leeds and I did a much smaller study of call centre workers, and it happened to be as the pandemic started. So some of our video diaries was of them in their homes. And the ones who absolutely loved it tended to be more experienced workers, partly because they didn't need to ask anyone any questions, and there wasn't really anyone to ask, but also because they'd spent years experiencing really tight control in the call center. And they were sort of going to us, hey, I can watch Netflix between calls, and this is brilliant. And it was great. They suddenly had freedom to do various personal things that they wouldn't have done before. The people who struggled tended to be the novices, partly because they tended to be working in the bedrooms in shared houses, and partly because it was new stuff to them, and it was much harder to ask people questions.
Do you want to answer those three? And
can I go back? Can I work backwards?
Yep.
So in terms of experience and inexperience, I think you're absolutely right. I think certainly from our data from the interviews, those people that fared better were those people that were very much embedded within the world of work, particularly within their workplaces. They knew what they were doing. They could get on with it. Those people that, and we did talk to people who changed jobs during the pandemic. We talked to people who had did some induction for people during the pandemic. Those people that were relatively inexperienced, both within their organisation and within work more generally, were much harder because and I certainly know this from starting a new job in the middle of the pandemic. You have no idea where to go to get answers to questions in a way that you would do if you're in a physical office space. So I think people really struggled with that. Also, but there are other issues sort of relating to experience and inexperience. So if we have, and we've talked to employers, and this is something that employers are really not necessarily getting their head round. So there's certainly been one employer that I know of that we spoke to that said everybody that starts now has to go back, has to be in the office at least 2 or 3 days a week, new starts, but the experienced people don't. So how on earth are they going to learn if the experienced people are at home and the inexperienced are going to be in the office? So employers, I can fully understand why employers are really struggling with how to manage this new hybrid working, but there's some fundamental issues like that really need to be addressed. Also, in terms of things like promotion, there's clear evidence even thus far that those people that are in work more, that are more visible, are more likely to get promoted. So if you really take the I want to be at home most of the time, then which seems to be more likely to be women, again we're going to have massive issues in terms of gender inequality. Going back to Greg's question in terms of management trust and differences in organisational relationships, I cannot answer that because we focus on employees. But one of the things we are planning to do, if we can grovel to the SRC to give us some more money at some point, which we are putting in a proposal for a new project, one of these will have 4 organisational case studies, which will look at how organisations are managing this new world of work, both from employee perspectives and from managerial perspectives. And we would like to look at a range of different organisations. And the other one, in terms of organisations trying to mirror domestic organisational experiences or the on-site experience at home, absolutely. And I think that is where the difficulties and challenges are. And when I was giving the example of the meta world, the organisational meta world, where they were actually visually trying to emulate it, I'm not sure that is going to help either. So yes, it's a different experience, and organisations need to be able to adapt to that different experience and rethink the world of work. I mean, that's what we were saying about working hours, working time, the overall work experience. If more people are going to be online, or in terms of a hybrid work arrangement, it's massively different. And that's what saying, have the opportunity to rethink what work is, to rethink the pace of work, to rethink outputs of work. This should be used as an opportunity to get it right, to press reset.
Good. Sorry, I seem to be disconnected and reconnected within a matter of seconds. So anyway, we've just 1 minute before we were due to end. Can I thank Abigail for a really interesting and very vivid presentation of what we've been experiencing over the past year in different degrees of joy and sorrow. And I think I'll hand over now to Gemma, who will tell us about what's next week. We have Vili Lendorov, who's coming, and he will be talking about how labour market digitalisation affects social mobility and inequality. So we hope you'll be able to follow us next week then. And thanks again very much, Abigail. And that's lovely to see you all. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.